You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
All you need is a few minutes to start your day off with something historic when you listen to the This Day in History podcast. Every day there's a new episode for you to listen and learn about what happened that day way back when. So listen and subscribe to This Day in History wherever you get your podcasts. That's This Day in History wherever you get your podcasts.
But looking back, it sure seems like Eisenhower was very much giving the vibe that he was lukewarm about Nixon, that it wasn't that I think he campaigned for him. I think he gave some speeches. I'm not sure. But there's certainly some stuff showing that Eisenhower was not the biggest Nixon fan, to the extent that that showed. Well, that's kind of hard. If you're trying to overcome these obstacles we've talked about, and you have the sitting the sitting president saying, yeah, well, he really hasn't done much. He has not been a big voice in this administration. And, I'm basically going to go golfing and not do that much for his campaign. That really, in a close election, which of course it was the closest of elections, that can make a difference, right?
Okay, I'm so glad to be joined by presidential historian David Priess. David,
hello.
How are you?
Amateur presidential historian. I'm reminded of that more and more every day, that I'm not working on a new presidential history project. That, I did a couple of books, as you know, one on intelligence and one on how presidents have left office. But I'm interacting with and reading the wonderful work of, no kidding, presidential historians, and reminded that, wow, I have a long way to go before I can claim that title. So I'll go back to my first expertise hat and say I'm a national security guy, an intelligence guy who dabbles in presidential history.
Yeah, I feel the same way. Although I tend to think anyone who asks questions, if you're asking questions, you're performing historical work. It's kind of like where we might be like the Abraham Lincoln lawyers of 1850 or so versus the big lawyers who argued before the Supreme Court or write dusty tomes. We're just doing our piecemeal collections work and exercising the practice and all of that.
Right. I had a conversation recently for the podcast that I alternately host called Chatter, and it was with a science writer. And I said something about, as a scientist, and it turns out that among science journalists and writers, there's some real tension over whether they should call themselves scientists, even if they were trained as scientists, even if they have the education, the knowledge, the skill. If they're not actually practicing as a scientist, there's some, I don't know, almost a stigma to calling yourself a scientist in some subfields if you're not actively doing the work. So I guess it's not just presidential historians that deal with this kind of thing.
I wanted to talk to you today because, look, you see the situation that we're in with the presidential race. What a tumultuous year we've had in 2024. And it's always good to anchor in history, and that's what we do on this program. But you're seeing a situation where we haven't seen the exact situation since 68, LBJ, Hubert Humphrey, where he handed off the election to him. That's really the last time we got that. But we also have a vice president running. Now, we've had one of those in 88, and we've had other examples in history. So I wanted to talk to you about that. Here's where I wanted to frame it and see if you agree or disagree with that.
Sure.
I don't think people are taking it seriously enough. There's actually only a few times in history that a VP has won in this scenario.
Yeah, you're exactly right. We look at, okay, first of all, people who have some interest in U.S. history and maybe political history and maybe even presidential election history will know that when it comes to presidencies, you've actually had quite a few presidents who were vice president before. Now, a lot of them came into office, in fact, most of them, by the death or resignation of the president before them, right? So you get the John Tylers, the the Fillmores, the two Johnsons, and so on. They're not elected. Some of them, like Truman, can get elected later, but they achieved office by non-electoral means originally. So you add those up along with people who did get elected either directly from the vice presidency to the presidency or who had a few years in between, and you've got, I think, 15 out of the 46 presidencies. So you've got almost a third. And that gives the impression that the vice presidency is a stepping stone to the presidency. But with 9 of those coming through death or resignation, it really doesn't add up that well. In fact, it's really rare. Vice presidents run for the office frequently. Quite often they don't get the nomination. And then sometimes they get the nomination and they lose in a case like a Gore or a Mondale, Humphrey, Breckinridge, Nixon the first time. But only 4 times that I count have you had a vice president who immediately became president after being vice president. And so you have Adams, 1797, Jefferson, 1801. Those 2 we have to put asterisks by because, obviously before the 12th Amendment, it wasn't, running in the same party the same way. But the only 2 cases since then, under what you would call the modern election system of the 12th Amendment, is Martin Van Buren in 1837, which I'm not old enough to remember, and I know you aren't, and George H.W. Bush in 1989. So you're right. It's exceedingly rare for a sitting vice president to get elected president straight out of that office.
I mean, speculate a bit about why.
Well, we tend to think of the vice president as really important because, you're a heartbeat away from the presidency, and it has happened so many times for ill reasons. But I mean, I think it was actually Dick Cheney who told me when I was interviewing him for my first book, when he basically said, as vice president, I just didn't have a lot to do. That's why I read so much intelligence and got so involved in foreign policy. Well, there's something to that. There's something to the fact that the vice president, even though it is much more, certainly since Carter and Mondale made it that way, the vice presidency is a much more enhanced position than it was for most of American history. There still is no direct role other than presiding over the Senate, which isn't much of a job anymore. It doesn't give you the opportunity, unless a very rare president makes it so, that the vice president is going to be out front representing the administration on all major issues and getting credit for all major accomplishments. That's just not the way politics works. So instead, you get vice presidents who, even if they're following a strong presidency, a popular president, they can't help but look weak by comparison, because here's been somebody in the administration, the actual president, who has been out there doing things, giving speeches, making policies, visiting disaster zones, meeting with foreign leaders, all the stuff presidents do that get attention. And the vice president is still a bit of an afterthought most of the time. So it's kind of hard for a vice president to run, simply because, and maybe it's not a conscious process, Bruce, in the minds of voters, but
it might not be. Yeah.
Just thinking about it, it's not easy to see a vice president as a strong, bold, decisive leader, which people tend to say they like in the presidency, because we've just had 4 or 8 years of that person doing nothing. And doesn't that show that they're not the bold, decisive leader that we might want? I think that's a big part of it. What do you think?
I think that there's an odd bit of a zero-sum game that can happen. It's almost like the president can't give because the president needs things. First of all, like you mentioned, a president must always seem as they're in charge, or people get worried. So you have that worry. Even though the president can't run for another term, they might get worried that if they're not doing enough, people will say, well, what are you doing in this White House, and not feel good. And then secondly, they have legacy they're looking for. So I see that come up in, say, the 68 with Johnson Humphrey, among many other quasi-psychological issues. You can't give credit if it comes at your expense.
Mm.
I see a little bit of that in the 2000 Clinton Gore, which, we could get into all of these, but with more detail. But I just see a sprinkling of that where it's like, well, I want people to remember Bill Clinton because he's a fairly young guy. He's still younger than Trump,
Yeah.
and doesn't fear reminding him of that. And then there's Gore, who's which happens, and I think it's happening in this election slightly, where it's like I want to run as my own man, and you see that, and then this tension is huge when, as historians, well, here I am just identifying ourselves as people doing the I like to call myself
Students of history.
I go as far as to say the plumber of history. I
Oh,
go in and
nice.
fix problems. We have this question before. It's like, what is it like running a vice president in an election? And we both seek to answer it. It's like, you got a problem, I fix
Yep.
it, Just looking at it that way, I just can't believe it sometimes. I'm like, because it seems to me like this is a problem, the working of the president and the vice president and the coordination in order to win an election that we think you both want to win, that should be so easy to solve.
Yeah.
The opposition has no say over it. You
Mm.
can decide to have lunch with, you can have LBJ standing next to Hubert Humphrey or Clinton standing next to Gore, like every day of the week if you want. And the opposition, Republicans or Democrats,
Mm.
can't say a thing about it. But it seems like historically there's just been problems passing the baton.
Absolutely. Right. It's a double-edged sword because often you have, and we'll get into, I'm sure, each of these cases in some detail, but if you have Andrew Jackson leaving office and in a sense passing the baton to Martin Van Buren, or Reagan passing the baton to Bush 41, or Clinton trying to pass the baton to Al Gore, Joe Biden trying to pass the baton to Kamala Harris. That's good if the president is popular. And most of those presidents were relatively popular. Some of them, the first two exceedingly so, near the end of their presidency. But that doesn't necessarily help, right? That just creates the contrast even more. So you want a popular president so that you can run on part of the legacy of your vice presidency, working with that person. But if the president is too popular, then you pale by comparison. And people look at the differences between the president and the vice president, and they say, "Oh, okay, we really wish we could have Reagan for a third term, or we really wish that Andrew Jackson were here instead of this little guy." So it cuts both ways. Now, it has worked in those cases, so we can't knock it, and we have to look at the factors why it worked. But you can't ignore the fact that you've had a whole lot of vice presidents who have tried to run. Nixon, notably in '60, was close.
Right.
But then you have the ones who tried and didn't even get the nomination, like a Dan Quayle. It is not a path to the presidency that's easy for a whole bunch of reasons. And I like to look at the difference. It's almost like a different political dynamic in presidency. It's the same country, they're the same offices, but when you look at the Adams-Jefferson time versus the others, the situation's so different. Still fun to look at, but it just doesn't seem the same because of the nature of the vice presidency then.
No, it's true. Yeah, you mentioned Martin Van Buren, and we could talk a bit there because that's an example of a successful one. It's not like Martin Van Buren sailed in. He had a divided opposition, which helped him, and he also got less votes and less support than the Jackson ticket. And there were numerous like Jackson imitators out there, like your Hugh Whites and your Harrisons on the Whig side, who were stealing some of that thunder because it was so obvious that Martin Van Buren was the old Kinderhook from New York and not Andrew Jackson, even though Jackson, he had his presumed support in all of that. So, I mean, anything to add there, Martin, the Martin Van Buren case?
Yeah, some specifics of that case, but then, some generalities that I think he points to and that are followed up in the positive and negative cases that follow. So what I did is I went back to one of my favorite current authors writing about the period, and that's Mark Cheatham, who teaches in Tennessee. And his great book from a few years ago called The Coming of Democracy, Presidential Campaigning in the Age of Jackson. And it wasn't until I was reminded by this that I remembered a couple of really interesting things about the 1836 election and the perceptions of Jackson and Van Buren. So obviously, they were political allies. You can't get much different personalities. And that's the interesting thing looking at these presidents and vice presidents who succeeded. Reagan and Bush, very different in many ways, as we'll talk about. Jackson and Martin Van Buren, very different. George Washington, John Adams, Jefferson, they're ironically, Adams and Jefferson in some ways are the most similar of those who actually achieved the presidency. But Martin Van Buren and Jackson, like, it's hard to draw a sharper contrast. And yet politically, it worked. The cult of Jackson, the charisma of Jackson, the energy, the ambition, combined with the political management skills and the tactical work of Van Buren, was an alliance that obviously worked for Jackson. And then it ultimately worked for Van Buren coming in. But they're very different. And in Mark's book, The Coming of Democracy, a couple of quotes that I found really interesting here from the time. We had James Buchanan at the time of 1836 saying, "We have everything to hope and nothing to fear from his character," this being Van Buren. "We may anticipate comparative peace and quiet in his day, for nearly all the exciting questions of the time have been happily settled by the bold and commanding genius of General Jackson." Now, even by Buchanan's standards, that's got a lot of sugar on it. But it seems to me that that's reflective of some of the attitude of the time, which is Jackson was such a commanding figure that even supporters of Van Buren were saying, yeah, he's just going to be a boring caretaker, right?
Right.
And the people were okay with that. They thought that things worked well. Then you had the former New York City mayor, Philip Hone, who was actually celebrating the end of Jackson's administration because he thought it was disastrous. He was not a fan. But he wrote about Van Buren, "He is too much of a gentleman to be governed by the rabble who surrounded his predecessor and administered to his bad passions." So even some anti-Jacksonians were looking at Van Buren and saying, yeah, at least we don't get the bad character that Andrew Jackson was. And I found that interesting. I had forgotten about that until I revisited this, that, there was some hope for Van Buren, not a lot, obviously, but there was some hope for him just because he wasn't Jackson. But then I think his inauguration changed some of that, because his inaugural speech famously was almost word for word, policy for policy. It was just continuation. It was third term of Andrew Jackson. The only thing really new in it was he was the first president to use the word slavery in an inaugural address. Otherwise, you're just looking at somebody who wanted to carry on the legacy.
You look at that and you say, well, maybe that's what you want. If you're the successful run is, we're going to keep things cool. And if you liked what you saw, we continue that. The other story that I heard about 1836 is that Andrew Jackson, obviously everyone knew that he was endorsing him. Presidents didn't take a stump, as those days. They didn't go out and campaign and things like that. But the endorsement was obvious, so that even the pretenders, like, say, a Hugh White, it was like, I'm more Jacksonian than Van Buren, could not contend with the fact that everyone knew the deal. His policy right arm, the VP choice that Van Buren chooses, Johnson, is a way of staving off, like, hey, there's going to be a little bit of that Jackson populism in the form of a person that Jackson likes as well, Richard Mentor Johnson. There's a Deposit Act that occurs where the government has this surplus, and they actually fund the banks in several states just from federal money. So federal money coming free to the states that they don't have to pay back in the middle of an election. If we did it these days, they would say Biden's trying to steal the election for Harris. But in a sense, that's exactly what Jackson does. So he kind of not only helps in an endorsement in political sense, but there's that little bit of a policy performance that helps Martin Van Buren, and people being generally happy in 36.
Yeah.
The lack of an opposition, the Whigs divided.
Yeah, you just nailed
yeah.
it. Like, yeah, I mean, you reminded me, Van Buren was such a continuation. I mean, if I recall correctly, he actually kept Jackson's cabinet intact for his, which is unheard of now. Even if you have a president of the same party, that doesn't happen. But Van Buren kept Jackson's cabinet. But the last point you made really speaks to that broader point, which, applies for both the positive and negative future cases, which is that it's a natural and regular cycle of American politics to have change after 8 years, sometimes 4 years. But other than the very early Republic and the Civil War Reconstruction Republican domination period, and then other than that, only the aberration of FDR's multiple terms, it's exceedingly rare to have extended one-party presidency for more than 8 years. So in this case with Van Buren, you had a divided opposition. The Whigs couldn't get their act together. They did not have the strongest candidates, I think, at the time. I think a general rule would be, if you're a vice president trying to succeed a president, the cards are stacked against you for reasons we've already mentioned.
Want to learn how you can make smarter decisions with your money? Well, I've got the podcast for you. I'm Sean Piles, and I host NerdWallet's Smart Money Podcast. On our show, we help listeners like you make the most of your finances. I sit down with NerdWallet's team of nerds, personal finance experts in credit cards, banking, investing, and more. We answer your real-world money questions and break down the latest personal finance news. The nerds will give you the clarity you need by cutting through the clutter and misinformation in today's world of personal finance. We don't promote get-rich-quick schemes or hype unrealistic side hustles. Instead, we offer practical knowledge that you can apply in your everyday life. You'll learn about strategies to help you build your wealth, invest wisely, shop for financial products, and plan for major life events. And you'll walk away with the confidence you need to ensure that your money is always working as hard as you are. So turn to the nerds to answer your real-world money questions and get insights that can help you make the smartest financial decisions for your life. Listen to NerdWallet's Smart Money Podcast wherever you get your podcasts.
Did archaeologists discover Noah's Ark?
Is the rapture coming as soon as the Euphrates River dries up?
Does the Bible condemn abortion?
Don't you wish you had a trustworthy academic resource to help make sense of all of this?
Well, I'm Dan Beecher, and he's award-winning Bible scholar and TikTok sensation Dr. Dan McClellan, and we want to invite you to the Data Over Dogma podcast,
where our mission is to increase public access to the academic study of the Bible and religion, and also to combat the spread of misinformation about the same.
But, in a fun way.
Every week we tackle fascinating topics, we go back to source materials in their original languages,
and we interview top scholars in the field.
So whether you're a devout believer,
or you're just interested in a clear-eyed, deeply informed look at one of the most influential books of all time,
we think you're going to love the Data Over Dogma podcast,
wherever you subscribe to awesome shows.
Hello all, Eric Rivenes with the Most Notorious podcast here. Each week I interview an author or historian about a historical true crime, tragedy, or disaster. Subject matter ranges from gunslingers to Gilded Age murder to gangsters to fires to pirates to wild prison breaks. My guests bring their incredible knowledge directly to you. Please subscribe to Most Notorious on your favorite podcast app. Cheers, and have a safe tomorrow.
If you have a divided opposition, if you have a weak opponent in the election, you have a chance. But if you have a single strong opponent that is representing a unified opposition, you're screwed as a general rule. Because in this case, I mean, if you would have pulled together the Whigs and had a strong candidate, and Van Buren, you mentioned, he lost some states. He had, in almost every state, if not every state, he pulled a lower percentage of the popular vote than Jackson.
From the editor's desk, David Priess is correct. Andrew Jackson received 54% of the popular vote in 1832. Martin Van Buren earned 51%. Andrew Jackson received 219 electoral college votes. Martin Van Buren got 170 electoral college votes.
So that shows that with a stronger opposition, he was quite vulnerable. And we'll see how that plays out with the other cases we'll talk about.
Yeah, I mean, so if we talk about the other successful one, we jump to 88, and you know some of the players involved here, but I will just preface it with it's similar in a way when you think about, and this is going on right now in the election we're talking about, where there's a few people criticizing Kamala Harris over, wait, you're switching at times between saying you'll keep the Biden policies going and you're the change candidate. And there's Democrats that want her to be the change candidate.
Yeah.
And with Bush, I'll give my perception, but certainly welcome yours, that it, the tactic, or at least after he won the primaries, and during the primaries, he was a vociferous defender of Reagan, and the other candidates like Bob Dole were less so. And you might have the oddball in the primaries like Jack Kemp, who was also a defender of Reagan, but that wasn't going to work with the VP sitting in the race. So then when he gets to the general, there might have been some cosmetic differences, but he's continuing that Reagan legacy.
Yeah, not much. And that's striking in a way if you consider the different visions that they brought in the campaign in 1980 when they were running against each other. The contrast is brought out even more starkly after I've just finished this new book, which you can see, but I'll mention
Max Boot.
Max's great new, truly the best biography on Reagan in print that I've seen. Reagan, His Life and Legend, and Max, brings the receipts and really shows that, Reagan was a big picture vision guy, whereas Bush was a more hands-on administrative manager. He'd run executive, he'd run offices before, in a very tactical way. So they're very different. But when it came to the election, Bush was basically riding the Reagan wave. He didn't run away from policy. Sure, he wasn't out there talking about supply side economics the whole time, but Reagan had tax reform. Reagan had slipped away from some of those principles as well. So yeah, in the general election, Bush certainly wasn't running from that legacy. But again, what a contrast. You had Reagan, already a mythical figure in many ways among the Republican electorate, running against Bush, who people just kind of shrugged about. And that's why we forget how close that election was. That in the summer of 88, for a short period of time, Dukakis had a sizable lead in the polls. And the fact that he ended up losing, again, it goes back to what I said a minute ago. It sure seems, I think everyone would agree, including those around Michael Dukakis, that he was not the strongest candidate in the Democratic field in the 1980s and 1990s. So if you would have had a stronger candidate, as I recall, the 88 convention, they still, most people were solidified around Dukakis, but Jesse Jackson was still in the hunt. He had not conceded yet. You still had people saying, oh, I wish Gary Hart hadn't screwed things up, or I wish, Biden hadn't had his plagiarism issue. There was still a lot of discontent with Dukakis even at the convention. And if you would have had a stronger Democratic candidate, Bush might have been more vulnerable than we remember him being. I mean, in the Electoral College, my memory says it was a landslide, like 400 plus for Bush and 100 something for Dukakis. But the popular vote was something like 53-46 or 53-47. And that's not a landslide. So yeah, Bush won, and he had a lot going for him in terms of economy doing well, in terms of the ending of the Cold War that Bush then brought over the finish line. But it sure seems like he stands out as one of the only two that did it for the reasons we're talking about, that there was not a unified opposition with a strong candidate, and he was able to squeak in.
That's a great commentary. I think the election, you're totally correct, 426 to 111.
Oh, wow.
The only surprises for Dukakis is that he was able to eke out New York and Iowa, a couple other states. The rest of it's all Bush. But you're right, it's 48 million to 41 billion. And 53% to 45.6. It's not a blow up, partially because Dukakis was able to unify the party a little more at the end and change the message a bit from his very plaid message. I do always want to point out that 45.6% was Dukakis, and with just 46.1, so you're talking about just 0.6% more, Trump wins the election in 2016. So
Right.
and that I think is significant. I always bring that up only the reason that, of course, we all know that the person with the most points, the most electoral votes wins. We're not questioning that. It's just that the caucus is seen as a disaster, and 2016 is seen as one of the greatest election comebacks, if you will, ever. And we're talking about a difference of, in the popular vote at least, of 0.6%.
That makes me think of, going to the negative cases, right? The vice presidents who ran, got the nomination and didn't. We have modern cases, right? We have Gore 2000, Humphrey 68, Nixon 60. But let's go back to the first one with John Breckinridge, 1860. And that's an election that, for many reasons, is an aberration, but it is a presidential election where a sitting vice president was running. But the dynamic you just mentioned, Bruce, was playing out here in spades. So you talk about 45, 46, 47% being enough to win if you have the Electoral College right. Well, Lincoln's percentage of the vote, popular vote, really sucked. But the Electoral College stacked up well for him. But talk about the divided opposition. It was the opposite in this case. It was a divided. I guess there was a lot of opposition to Breckinridge, but it was a lot from his own supposed party. So that, you had Douglas and Bell pulling some votes, pulling a few electoral votes away. I don't think Breckinridge could have won just because Lincoln had the North almost locked up, other than I think some votes in New Jersey because of the split electoral vote there. But it could have been thrown to the House. I can easily make the case that if Douglas and or Bell doesn't run and Breckinridge is the sole nominee, that it gets thrown to the House, and then it's anyone's game. So that's
from the editor's desk. In 1860, Lincoln got just 39.7% of the popular vote. Douglas, one of the Democrats running, got 21.5%. Breckinridge got 14%, and Bell, the Constitution Party, or really Old Whig Party, got 13%.
But again, it points to some of the same dynamics. It's about the what's the split of the opposition? What's the difference between the popular and electoral vote? I think it's a good thing for all of us that Breckinridge was not elected president in 1860.
Absolutely.
But that's just a retrospective political judgment without knowing the man.
The 1860 is so endlessly fascinating. I think, the only chance that you would have had of beating Lincoln there is either what you say, which was just not politically possible, more politically possible, but still a long shot, is that Bell, Democrats decided, and as in some states, there were fusion tickets, like whoever gets the most, or they tried to get, whoever gets the most votes will go with your electors, that Bell could have become the number one opposition to Lincoln and stealing some states, but still acceptable in the South. He could have pulled off, still a long shot. Lincoln, when he got the nomination, won the election. It was a Republican year. The other thing I got to say about Breckinridge is interesting in that is that, we tend to look at him now as that Confederate, because he did become a general. But prior to that, he wasn't a quite moderate choice, but Jefferson Davis and others did have to be convinced to give him the nomination. There were more ultra Southerners that they could have given that sort of Southern Democratic ticket.
That there are just so many variables and differences in that election. It's hard to generalize from it. But if it fits into the bigger pattern, then it makes sense.
Dukakis, Bob Shrum, and Democratic strategist, his comments, for whatever they're worth, yes, Biden, yes, Gary Hart, yes, Dick Gephardt, all would have been able to beat Bush. Hey, that's a case where a vice president was successful. Let's talk about some other cases where they weren't.
Sure. So, we mentioned Breckinridge. Obviously, Richard Nixon runs as vice president in 1960. That one, the dynamic that stands out to me is, and what I don't know, Bruce, is how much of this is in retrospect. How much of this do we know now, but people didn't know at the time? I don't know. But looking back, it sure seems like Eisenhower was very much giving the vibe that he was lukewarm about Nixon, that it wasn't that I think he campaigned for him. I think he gave some speeches. I'm not sure. But there's certainly some stuff showing that Eisenhower was not the biggest Nixon fan, to the extent that that showed. Well, that's kind of hard if you're trying to overcome these obstacles we've talked about, and you have the sitting the sitting president saying, yeah, well, he really hasn't done much. He has not been a big voice in this administration, and I'm basically going to go golfing and not do that much for his campaign. That really, in a close election, which of course it was the closest of elections, that can make a difference, right?
I think largely historians agree that made the difference. And there was the famous give me a week or give me a minute and I'll think about something he's done for my administration. And totally, I think you're right to use the term vibe, because totally misunderstood. Eisenhower was simply old-fashioned press conference, simply saying to the boys, ask me that next time. Totally misperceived. And of course, it's on television. Kennedy uses it for their own committee, and it looks awful. Yeah. The only thing to say is that I know that Richard Nixon would have us believe that it was maybe Eisenhower said, he's not healthy. Please don't ask him to campaign. You can't. If you ask him, he's going to go. I tend to believe what you're saying, that it doesn't matter, in a sense that, first of all, Eisenhower campaigning for anyone too much is probably a lot to ask. Like, he just didn't like the politics and stuff. And then maybe whatever it was a failure. They used him a little at the end for some big rallies. That's what most historians and political people look at and say, big failure. I think objectively, and Nixon learned his lesson later, don't have TV debates if you're the incumbent VP. But that was at least letting Kennedy in was an issue.
Of course, Nixon gets his revenge of sorts, 8 years later. And that's another failed case, right? The Humphrey case. Now, 68 being just a crazy year for Democratic politics. Some of the dynamics still come here. Nixon, while, he didn't walk to the nomination in 68, he did have to work for it. But there was consolidation around him in a way that he was a stronger opponent than perhaps Humphrey could have faced. So that's a disadvantage. Instead of having a popular outgoing president, you have a, divisive outgoing president. And the entire Vietnam situation makes it such that a lot of the dynamics of following on the heels of a Jackson earlier or a Reagan later just don't apply in 68 for Johnson. So it's easy to see why Humphrey, for those reasons, had a disadvantage.
I noticed in both cases, in 60 and 68, Kennedy in 60, Nixon in 68, both sort of, sort of lay hands off the president and attack the vice president during these campaigns. And Kennedy going to the extent of saying, see, he doesn't even want his own VP. Of course, attacking the administration the whole time. Nixon in 68, similar thing, saying like, nobody works harder than Lyndon Johnson. Faint backhand praise is like the nicest thing you can say. So your opponent could have totally disastrous policies, but all you're saying is he works hard. He gets up early and works at his desk. There's endless speculation about, what Lyndon Johnson wanted in that election at that point. I tend to believe by the end that he did want Democrats to prevail, want Humphrey to win, but during the year, like Eisenhower, it certainly wasn't his focus the whole election. That's for sure. Yeah, you see that different, like with Reagan, where Reagan would jump in and attack the caucus from time to time. Lyndon Johnson would not during a war. That was, I think, part of it. He wouldn't do that. Yeah. So
So and then like almost every successive election, you have a vice president somehow involved, right? So you have 76. Where Ford is running. He was vice president, only briefly president. So it doesn't quite apply. But then you get Reagan elected, and then Bush is running as vice president. You get, after the Bush election, you get Clinton, and then Gore is running. But we forget in the middle there was this guy called Walter Mondale. Now,
Right.
Walter Mondale was not running in 1980. He was not running as vice president, but he was one of those who, as vice president, came back and ran again. Nixon, we just mentioned, right? He is the successful one. He is the vice president who was stepped away, not of his own choosing, but stepped away, but then ran again later and won. And he was the only one until Joe Biden.
Interesting.
The only two that have been vice presidents and made it to the presidency later in an election that I can recall. I might be missing one, but I think those are the only two.
No, absolutely right.
Mondale tried in 84, and it seems to me that the fact that there are only two who have done it when there are plenty of vice presidents who were ambitious enough that they tried points out how much harder it is than even winning it straight out of the vice presidency. Because not only were you second-class citizen for 4 years or 8 years, usually, but then you've been doing something else for a while, trying to come back, and you're almost reminding everybody that your party lost the last election, whether you were in it or not. So it's really hard. So then you have to get to 2000, right, to see an actual vice president as the nominee immediately afterwards, and you get to Bush v. Gore.
I think that one thing, too, that's going on there is, so if you're going to talk about 12 years of a ticket, essentially, because if the VP is going to be elevated and run, now it's different this year because it's only a 4-year presidency, and then Harris is now the nominee. But after, say, Clinton, and then you have Gore running, it's a lot to ask an American political party with some of the egos in Washington, D.C. I don't know. I'm in Jersey. You're a little closer to the action. There's still a bunch of egos there, right? It's still pretty high on the ego monitor.
I think there's no shortage of ego in the Beltway area. Yeah,
no shortage. I mean, you could say the whole East Coast, but basically, yes. So, I mean, keeping a party down, essentially, for saying when there's all of these senators you start with, generally senators, but other people. In the case of 2000, you had Bill Bradley, who ran a kind of meaningless primary, but still ran one. And Richard Gephardt was the silent primary and essentially, as the majority leader in the House, he had a lot of buddies there, and he was leading a movement the whole time. He was at various points sort of challenging Gore on things behind the scenes, challenging the administration. As I understand it, Gephardt was not happy as a very kind of moral person whose family was very important, not very happy with the whole Clinton and Lewinsky shenanigans, but chose not to speak out in about it. That was a potential nominee that was sort of kept down by the Clinton White House. It's just a lot to manage to keep things open for a VP, and then there's a lot of hurt feelings and all kinds of other things that aren't good for a campaign.
The corporate world is like the ocean. It's alluring, but it's also full of deadly creatures that can shred you to pieces.
It becomes kind of like a Game of Thrones political arena where everyone's trying to murder you to get your job or your title.
As former corporate executives, we know firsthand that navigating corporate waters is not easy.
My family doesn't come from corporate background, so I didn't have any sort of guidance in that.
I wish people would be able to understand in this corporate world that talking about things that don't work or identifying problems does not mean you're a problem.
We'll dive deep into what happens behind fancy corporate doors or Zoom backgrounds or whatever.
Are they really performance improvement plans or just a legal tool to get rid of people?
I know a lot of people have been saved because of them.
We've created a show to help you navigate tricky corporate situations based on research and real-life experience.
I have really good advice. Don't go to a strip club with your team.
Listen to the Ambie Award-nominated podcast, Surfing Corporate.
Right on. And also, we forget in 2000 that, Bush did, this is Bush, 43. Bush did unify the party. That, yes, there was a nomination and there was primaries, and it wasn't clear that he was going to get it, but he had a strong team going into that primary fight, and once he consolidated, this is that case of having a unified, strong opposition. You had a track record as a governor of a big state, which Americans have tended to like governors in these elections.
True.
When you have a Bill Clinton for 8 years, you're coming off of that. It doesn't seem weird to have a governor from a state who has not served in Washington, D.C., because, hey, we did it with Clinton and it worked pretty well. Some people thought we did it with Reagan and worked pretty well. He had a strong candidate. So Gore had those factors against him that we've talked about. And then he had a relatively strong, at least a unified party against him.
Yeah, I think that was no doubt about it. 2000, and the other party, and the way to do it is the other party's eager to get the White House back after 8 years. They feel like they're beaten, and they don't like seeing a Democrat being where they should be. And especially, both of us can remember the time when it was supposed to be that the White House was Republican, and Democrats were temporary occupants, like maybe Carter's one term, maybe Clinton gets in for a term, and then there are a lot of people thought he wouldn't get reelected. So yeah, there was all those hurt feelings. It's like, let's unify and get it back. People were pretty unified in the end. I guess when he gets the nomination, everybody backs Obama on the other side of things. But anything else on that topic of the losers, so to speak, that's worth mentioning?
No, but it just the more you talk, the more I'm thinking there's something to this idea of just the cycles, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, sure, you had, several two-term presidents at the beginning of the Republic, and then you had a lot of Republicans in succession from the 1860s to the 1880s. Yeah, I got that. But in the modern era, man, I mean, you can have blocks, like you said, of the Republican presidency from essentially 1969 to 1993 with only Jimmy Carter in the way. Hard to imagine that now. I mean, let's say that Kamala Harris wins this election, and obviously it would be her only first term, right? So she could run again. But that would mean from 2009, right? Obama comes in, he serves 8 years. You would have a 4-year interregnum of Trump.
Right.
Then you have 4 years of Biden. Then you have 4 years of Harris. So Harris would be running for re-election with Democrats in power for, 16 of the last 20 years and asking the American people to say, you know what, with one interrupted 4-year term that was historically unique in many ways, I want you to send me back to the White House for the 20th year of Democratic presidencies out of the last quarter century. That's a remarkable thing. That is remarkable. Apart from the personalities, apart from the opponents, apart from the dynamics, that is just unusual in American history.
It's unusual, and I think if you look at what was at work, two different things at work. If we even establish that that's something that's going on or going to go on. In the first instance, the Republican domination was a kind of government backlash, law and order reaction to the revolutions of the 60s, utilizing certain electoral dynamics, such as people moving down south actually hurt Democrats, and moving west hurt Democrats and helped Republicans to get more electoral votes in regions where they could compete. And here, if it's going on, it's a kind of Democrats have figured out that they can win statewide elections, having a lot of trouble with legislators, a lot of trouble with Congress at times, a lot of trouble fighting gerrymandering in Congress and things like that. But they're pretty good at, getting a good college student and liberal base and union and getting those actual feet on the ground or mail-in ballots and voting in big elections statewide. And that could be what's going on. And the other side will figure it out. I already see Trump, this election, the nervousness about mail-in ballots, I notice, has gone away, where he's advocating people to vote early in Georgia and Pennsylvania.
Yep.
And I think they're all using the same technique. So you can already see a catch up there.
Yeah.
But if what you're saying is true, the other thought I have is, I see that both ways. That could be a negative for Kamala, but it's also like, just from that, if it's just about, which I think voters do this, a little bit of this, give the other guys a chance.
Mm-hmm.
If it's that, it's only been 4 years.
Yep.
And I think we'd be having a different conversation if this was VP Harris, running in 2028.
Yeah.
That's
totally.
speculation upon speculation, but
yeah, of course. Yeah, we just keep building on it. One final thought that
Yes.
occurs to me, building off of this, but slightly different, is the role that a vice president who has been the nominee of his or her party, then certifying the results of the opponent. And Al Gore did this in 2001. Humphrey did this. Nixon did this. You are the vice president, and you are the one certifying that in a couple of close elections in those, right, with 2000 and in 1960, you are the one presiding over the certification of your opponent becoming president. And we take it for granted that that's how it's supposed to be. And most people didn't think about that much until January 6th, a couple of years ago. But I got to give credit here to somebody who doesn't get a lot of credit, and that's John Adams. And
John Adams.
I will do a shout out to Lindsay Chervinsky, a great presidential historian of the early republic, who has her new book out on John Adams called Making the Presidency, John Adams and the Precedents That Forged the Republic. I look at John Adams through the lens of what was so important as the first follower to lock in precedents about the presidents. And the point she makes is very simple, and one that is just too easy to overlook, which is that Adams set the real precedent in 1801 because no president had ever left office after losing an election. Washington walked away. So Adams was the first person running for the presidency as president who lost. And we take it for granted that you step away at that point. Adams did it. And now it seems weird when there's somebody not certifying an election or somebody who's not conceding an election. So a shout out to someone who doesn't get it very much, which is John Adams.
Oh, great. Yeah, great point. Everybody get that book, Chervinsky's book. She's been on. She's great. If nothing else, I mean, there's been a lot of precedent of this. It's when I hear, are you going to be loyal and not? It's like, well, if you're saying you want to do this, you're telegraphing, in effect, to Harris that if she loses the election, she should do this because that's what you guys were going to do anyway. And she should play the game the same way. You're banking on the fact that she won't because Democrats don't do that is essentially what is really going on there, but people aren't saying. So it's a whole interesting process, but great points. Hey, great talking to you, David.
Always a pleasure.
Anything you want to promote or anything listeners should do? Should they sign up for this Chatter podcast?
Yeah. So once a week, we have a long form conversation. My alternate host, Shane Harris, now of The Atlantic, and I tend to trade off episodes. And sometimes we'll go 2 hours with somebody who's on what we call the frontiers of national security. So history, culture, technology, the arts, but something that relates back to national security issues from a different perspective. So yeah, it's on what used to be called Twitter at That Was Chatter, but it's on all the podcast platforms just as Chatter, not cheddar the cheese, but chatter the talking term.
Chatter the talking. Okay.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you.
Great, David. Thanks for coming on.
You bet. You're welcome.